Isn't that cool? That you can be the worst possible outcast in your own mind. You can be the most shameful person in the history of the universe, and you're exactly the one that Jesus wants to talk to, and you're the one that Jesus is going to want to know who he really is. To put all of this in its full context, the first story, the first sermon, the first reporting of Jesus being the Messiah is told by a fallen, sinful woman. I don't know about you, but that's encouraging to me. If ever I doubt my ability to go out someplace and teach or preach or have any kind of authority because of my history, I like to think back on stories like this and say, maybe it's those of us that completely get the need for grace that ought to be the ones that are preaching about it.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. Today we're going to do the second in the series of podcasts about the God of second chances. These are legacy podcasts that take us back to the time when we still had the extreme pleasure of having Dr. Mark Laaser as our director and host of our podcast. On today's show, we'll do our second installment of the God of second chances. And in this podcast, we're going to talk about David and his adultery with Bathsheba. We're also going to talk about the very famous story about Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well. Here now is installment number 2 of the God of Second Chances.
So far, we've talked about the prodigal son, the woman caught in adultery, and today I thought we'd move back to the Old Testament and talk about one of my favorite Bible characters, King David.
And David was a character.
David was a character, and prone, I suppose, as many men of great power are, to getting themselves involved in inappropriate relationships.
Well, that's a great place to take our listeners today, because this series has we've been getting some nice comments about this series, and I think it's there's something very empowering about seeing God through the eyes of understanding that he is a God of second and third and fourth chances.
I was looking at this story just to familiarize myself again with the text and the passages of it, and I thought, actually, well, on one hand, I don't like fully doing this. I think it might be important actually to read this story.
Okay.
There's 2 parts to it, I think, and the average listener that we have, I suspect, is somewhat familiar with the Bible, and we know that David was the second king of Israel. His father-in-law, actually, Saul, was the first king of Israel, the one that the people of Israel had demanded to have. So, and as we know, David is generally regarded as the greatest king of all time. The lineage of Jesus is traced back to David, and I think that's one of the things we want to reiterate later, because when we think about God at the second chance, after the fairly egregious sexual sins that David is guilty of perpetrating, to know that he is the patriarch that will lead directly to the line of Jesus himself, I think is an indication that God is the God of the second chance. Well, my favorite part of the story, actually, because a lot of what we do here at Faithful and True is work with couples and work with relationships. And David had a marriage, as I just referred to one of the daughters of Saul, a woman by the name of Michal, which is an interesting name, but it's a Jewish name for a woman, I guess. And it was kind of a politically arranged marriage. I think it was like a lot of times in arranged marriages that kings and queens do. They're trying to solidify this, they're trying to pacify that. And so I think Saul felt, and there's a part of the story where Saul finds out that his daughter Michal has fallen in love with David. I think he sees that as a good political thing to have happen. So I guess the question is really, Michal evidently loved David. Did David really love Michal? But then I'm going to start with a passage here that would indicate that Michal was not always perhaps an easy woman to live with. Are you ready, Randy?
I'm on the edge of my seat.
Okay. 2 Samuel chapter 6. Now, this follows what is, in fact, probably one of the most major developments in the history of the Jewish people. The Ark of the Covenant, which contained the Ten Commandments, had been housed first in the desert when they were first given to Moses, and then when the people of Israel crossed the river Jordan under the leadership of Joshua and Caleb and completed their campaign to gain control of the territory there. The Ark of the Covenant had remained more or less in a tent. It had never been brought into any city. And the reason for that was they considered that it needed to be mobile because there was not a time up to that point where they felt like they possessed a city in a safe enough way to keep the Ark of the Covenant safe. So in our story here in 2 Samuel 6, David has finally managed to solidify things enough to make Jerusalem safe enough to bring the Ark of the Covenant finally into the city of Jerusalem. I think those that are familiar with the Jewish story, the story of the chosen people, can understand and appreciate the fact that this is, in fact, a major development. But what is interesting now is that David, this is starting with verse 14 of the 6th chapter, David wearing a linen ephod. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. And what a linen ephod is, I think of, I don't know what I start thinking of. I probably shouldn't say what I start thinking of, but, I think it's probably not a whole lot of clothing. Danced before the Lord with all his might, while he and the entire house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts and the sounds of trumpets. As the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. David sacrificed burnt offerings. They brought the ark into the tent that David had pitched for it. After he had finished sacrificing the burnt offerings and fellowship offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord Almighty. Then he gave a loaf of bread, a cake of dates, and a cake of raisins to each person in the whole crowd of Israelites, both men and women. This was quite a treat back in that day. And all the people went to their homes. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, "How the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, disrobing in the sight of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would do." David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord." Does this sound like a bit of a domestic dispute?
Squabble.
Yes,
Yeah.
Michal is basically shaming him. She's calling him worse than a vulgar fellow. He is disrobing. She's basically accusing him of exhibitionism here,
Right.
and inappropriate, lewd, and lascivious behavior.
So it sounds like that piece of clothing that we were talking about must be some sort of maybe loincloth.
The ephod.
Yeah, the ephod just might be a flimsy loincloth of some sort.
I see your imagination running wild with that, Randy.
Well,
as to what that must have been.
Well, and then she gave him it's like Dancing with the Stars. She held up a very low score for his dancing down in the, She did not approve.
She did not approve of the dancing.
Of that performance, not even a little.
Maybe that was an important part of the story that only you, Randy, would have read between the lines. That his dancing was probably not that good.
I'm an astute biblical scholar. There's no doubt about that.
You've been poring over the Hebrew here, have you not?
Mm-hmm.
Well, anyway, verse 22, finally, in this section of the story. "I will become even more undignified than this," said David, "and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by these slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honor." So in other words, the slave girls were kind of grooving on this, evidently. I don't know.
And obviously, he doesn't mind ticking his wife off with his comments on top of it.
Well, it gets even better than that in terms of, something that we do have to kind of read between the lines here. But now we know that David has really managed to tick Michal off. She considers him vulgar, inappropriate, disgraced himself in front of the whole people of Israel. But this is, like sometimes in the Bible stories, there's a postscript. And here's our postscript in verse 23 of the 6th chapter. Michal, daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Now, why, Randy, would you say that doesn't say she's barren, doesn't say she's incapable? The Bible sometimes does point that out. But that's not what the Bible says. It just says after they've had this domestic argument, this squabble, which is a fairly big deal, she has no children. I tend to look at it, and maybe I'm reading between the lines, and maybe there's some of our black and white thinkers out there that will chastise me for doing so. I just kind of think that David at that point in time just cut her off, had nothing more to do with her, perhaps emotionally, spiritually, or even sexually. So now in chapter 11, we learn that David is continuing to fight a number of battles against all the enemies around Israel. He's trying to solidify the political power of the country, in which he obviously, during the course of his career, does a great job of. In this particular chapter, he's fighting some battles. It's not important to know all the necessary powers that he's up against. But for some reason, on this particular occasion, he's not leading the troops himself. He was good at that, but I think as he got older, he started delegating the authority to some other generals. In this case, a guy by the name of Joab. And Joab is fighting a battle. David is back at the palace. And if we remember the estranged situation with Michal, and we remember the fact that maybe he's a lonely king, power is sometimes quite a weight on your shoulders. Sounds to me like he's not able to sleep. I'm not going to read through all this because it would take too long. But the gist of it is, and it's described there if you want to look at it in chapter 11, he's walking the balcony at night. My sense of it is the pressure, the stress of the warfare and the battle and, all of the political pressure, he's not able to sleep. So he's roaming the balcony. And that's where he stumbled across as he looks down. And in those days, the palace was the highest point in Jerusalem. So the city was built on a hill, and you could look down at some of the other houses and the rooftops. And there, of course, as we know, most people know this story, Bathsheba was taking a bath, and David was able to look right down on it. The Bible describes that as he saw her nakedness, he became rather fascinated by that. So far in our story, we've had David the exhibitionist, and now he's kind of a voyeur. By the way, it's not something he's intentionally gone out to do. It just, he stumbles across it. But he pursues it, and he asks some of his servants who this woman is. Turns out she's the daughter of so-and-so and the wife of one of his soldiers, Uriah the Hittite. So he finds out who she is. He knows he's married, but nevertheless he sends for her. And the Bible is, at this point, when it comes to sexuality, it's just very succinct. It said that they lied together, which means that they had sex together. And then the Bible goes on right away to say, Bathsheba went home, and after fasting a little bit and trying to purify herself, she finds out she's pregnant, and she sends David a message. Now David's got the classic problem that a lot of addicts have. He's got a situation where his sexual sin, the adultery he's committed, has resulted in a consequence. And he tries to cover it up. And he brings Uriah, the husband, back from the battlefield. He sends instructions to have him come back. And he basically treats him well, greets him kindly, and says, "Oh, you've been fighting so hard. Why don't you go spend some time at home with your wife?" Uriah is a faithful and honest man, and he knows Jewish custom. And his belief as a soldier, when he's in the middle of a battle, he's not to enjoy any of the comforts of a house. Or being with his own wife. And he explicitly says that. When I'm in the middle of battle, I'm not to go home, eat food, lie with my wife. And so he comes back to David, and David has been trying to get him to have sex with Bathsheba so that
he can claim that the child is his.
Is Uriah's, and not his own. So David is, to be honest, David gets kind of angry about this, and it's interesting that he's getting angry about the fact that some guy is actually a man of integrity, a man of faith, a man of discipline, and he's angry at that guy. And I would say that's typical of a lot of addicts that I've known. We'll tend to get mad at other men that we perceive to be so much more honorable at times than we are. So he sends instructions to the front to Joab, the next battle, to put Uriah
In the front.
and they have some rather good archers, the enemy does, and Uriah is picked off evidently rather quickly, and he's killed. David now has free access to marry Bathsheba, which he does. Now, I think most of our listeners will know the story keeps going, and Nathan, the prophet, figures this out, and nobody's getting fooled here. He gets married, and like a month later, Bathsheba has a baby. So, the deception is rather obvious. So Nathan comes, and again today we don't have a lot of time to get into all of this story that he tells. He weaves the tale. He gets David to be angry at the story Nathan is telling. And then one of the more famous lines in the whole Bible, Nathan points his finger at David and says, "You are that man who has stolen a sheep." Now David is disgraced. And Nathan basically prophesies that the son that Bathsheba and David have had as a result of their infidelity, God is going to take, God is going to kill. And David fasts and he mourns and he prays for God not to do that, for God to spare him of that consequence. Nevertheless, the boy dies. And then David decides to finally, after a few weeks, eat some food and finally goes and he lies again with Bathsheba and they have a son. Now, this son that they have as a result of that connection turns out to be none other than Solomon. So Solomon, of course, the wisest man in all of the Bible, who we'll also turn to in another segment of our radio show because he's also one of our characters in terms of God of the second chance. But nevertheless, for the moment, the story, in a way, has a happy ending. I never like it in the Old Testament where God allows certain people to be killed and, that kind of thing. But nevertheless, there was a consequence to the sin. I think one of the things in terms of God of the second chance is that, number one, given the fact that he committed adultery, God could have had David killed. He could have removed him from the throne. He could have had Bathsheba killed. He could have had her die in childbirth. There could have been a lot of other consequences here. But no, God allows David and Bathsheba to continue to be together. They're generally widely regarded as lovers and all of that. And it's out of their line that come, the lineage of Jesus himself. So I think one of the great parts about this story is that something good can come out of something that was sinful, and that an act of adultery led to a relationship that eventually produced the lineage of Jesus himself and Solomon, and a whole lot of great things happened for the people of Israel after David had committed this egregious sin. I'd like just to pause for a moment, like we sometimes do, and just invite, through the power of the Holy Spirit, God to speak to all of our listeners in the way that only God can through the Holy Spirit, and say, where do you find meaning or where do you find instruction in this story? I know as a recovering person myself, this story gives me great comfort because I know that all of the good things that have happened, after I was discovered, found out, confronted, this story kind of confirms that God is not finished with us. God may not even have really started yet. And that if we are humble, David humbled himself after this experience. David fasted and he prayed and he humbled himself. And it was out of that I think God allowed him to remain king, to have another son. The son was rather important. The lineage goes on to Jesus. I think the humbling, the fasting, the praying, the brokenness that David had is one of the key signs that God will respect, and God is the God of the second chance when we're like that. He is not finished with us, and he may have many more great things in store for us.
Well, it's amazing how the sinful nature of David's early behavior really resulted in magnificent results that God had planned. We often forget that God knows us much better than we know ourselves.
That's right.
And he knows what lies ahead for us. And we never know what God's plan is for us. But in God's wisdom, he knew that Solomon was on the horizon. The family lineage of Jesus himself was on the horizon.
Right.
And this does give great hope to everyone out there who is struggling because of their own sinfulness,
Right.
and that God has got an unimaginable ability to forgive us.
Right. I hope all of our listeners today will take a great sense of hope from stories like this. That's one of the reasons we're doing this series. One of the major things that propels addicts in the direction of their acting out behaviors is shame. And God, through stories like this in the Bible, wants us to know that, as Paul teaches us in the New Testament, there is no sin that separates us from the love of Jesus Christ. There is no sin that is not common to man, all of us. And for any of us who have ever committed adultery, I think this story of David gives us a great sense that there is hope. Now, one last thing to point out, and that is, I know some of the addicts, when they finally get clean, finally get sober, finally get honest, they do sometimes expect or like or want or long for God to reward them by not punishing them with any kind of confrontation or any kind of consequences. I do think that I've seen over and over again that God sometimes chooses to allow consequences because the ongoing consequences are what allow an addict to continue to be humble and broken and to take their recovery seriously. So if that is the case for you, I know that's hard. I know that's tragic. I know that's very difficult. That's exactly where all the men need lots of support. And I'd also like to say part of the story I don't like is that Michael, although she sounds like a bit of a hateful person here, I don't like the fact that, the ending for her is not as glorious as it is for David. So for all the wives listening, I just want you to hear from me. I raised this story, and I do feel bad for Michael. I just don't think what happened in this story is totally fair to her. But there's times in Scripture where we don't always understand. Today we're going to get to also one of my favorite stories. It's actually one of the stories that's behind our 3 spiritual questions that we ask in the book entitled Becoming a Man of Valor. It's the story of the woman at the well in John chapter 4.
And share that story with our listeners, because I think that your average fan of Scripture might not be aware of that particular story. I think it's a really interesting one.
Well, I think there's so many stories in Scripture where people have maybe memorized or focused or locked in on one particular line of the story. And when we do that, we don't necessarily put the story in its entire larger context and get all of the things there that the writer here, in this case John, the Apostle John, is wanting us to know. So yes, in the telling of the story from start to finish, I think we'll get a picture of that larger context and why it's really important to our population of people that we work with here at Faithful and True.
Right.
So it starts with Jesus in Jerusalem being questioned by the Pharisees. And the Pharisees, as we know, were bent on exposing Jesus as being a theological heretic. They wanted to accuse him of being a false teacher, of committing heresy, so that they could bring him to trial and somehow punish him.
Have evidence against him.
And ideally they wanted to have him put away, to be put to death, which in fact they accomplished through the manipulations that happened at the end of the gospel story. So in our story, they are questioning him about matters of theology. They're questioning him about who has the authority to baptize. So as we all know, in the early part of the story of Jesus there, his cousin, John, is leading the way. He's the voice crying in the wilderness. He's the one saying, prepare the way for the Lord. And he is, in fact, baptizing people. He baptized Jesus. We all know the story of Jesus' baptism, where God's voice came down from heaven talking about, this is my son with whom I'm well pleased. So John was baptizing people. That eventually got him in trouble and got him killed, of course. Jesus in our story is getting emotionally tired. One of the things that I think John is trying to point out to us, John, I think, as a writer, is very good at pointing out both the humanity of Jesus and the divinity of Jesus. And we're going to see those elements in our story. So first of all, in terms of the humanity, we see here that Jesus is emotionally tired. He's emotionally tired of the questions and the conflicts. So let's just pause for a moment and ask any of those listening to us, have you ever been tired of questions? The same question over and over again, or a series of questions, or people who just seem to ask way too many questions. So I think Jesus is experiencing something that is common to all of us, really, that there are times when we just don't want to hear one more question.
Well, it's emotional fatigue, and it's kind of coupled with when you're tired of being bombarded by a line of questioning, it attacks you physically with your physical strength and your endurance for it, as well as that emotional strength that you can only imagine the emotional strength of someone like Jesus.
Right, that is right. So Jesus decides in our story to make a journey back up north to Galilee. And in Galilee, we have the sense that there's not the authorities, there's not the oppression, there's not the questioning. Jesus has a lot of friends up there. He's well received, well liked, well respected. He's safe up there. And so he decides to make that journey. Now, as the crow flies, in order to go from Jerusalem to Galilee, in those days you would go right smack dab through the region known as Samaria. And we know, of course, from a number of stories in the New Testament that the Jews hated the Samaritans. The Samaritans were one of the groups and tribes that were left over from the 10 northern tribes of the Jews, allowing themselves, particularly in captivity, to intermarry. So they were the results of intermarriage. They were unfaithful Jews in that sense. So while lots of them had Jewish history, heritage, and blood in them, they were not pure Jews, and as such were considered unclean. You were not to talk to them. You were not to associate with them. If you accidentally came into physical contact with a Samaritan, you had to go to the temple to be ritually cleansed. By the way, this dynamic, this hatred, this prejudice that the Jews had against the Samaritans makes the story, of course, of Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan make a lot of sense. So in our story, there's just no way that a respectable Jew would travel through Samaria, but Jesus decides to do that. The average Jew would circumvent it and go to the east and then back to the west, and that journey would take an extra 2 days. Jesus decides to go directly, and the next thing that happens in our story is that he comes to a village called Sychar. Sychar is one of the Samaritan village. The really only significance of it geographically is that there is a well about 1 mile south of Sychar, which is where actually Jesus stops. The Bible tells us that at this point, Jesus, being already emotionally tired, now is physically tired from the walk, and he decides to sit down and rest. So the humanity of Jesus is resting. He sends the disciples ahead, and he's sitting there by this well. Now, what is famous about this well is that it was part of the inheritance that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. He had 12 sons. We all know that story of Joseph and the favoritism, the coat of many colors, the brothers being so jealous that they have him sold into slavery. He winds up down in Egypt, and we all know that story of how he comes to save the entire Middle East because of his accurate predictions about Pharaoh's dreams. So in the process of that, Joseph becomes second in command in the entire kingdom of Egypt. I like to think that Joseph, because of the power he enjoyed in Egypt, could have had a tomb built for himself, could have been very royally treated at the end of his life. And instead, he asked that when he dies, that his body be transported back to this region and that he be buried next to this well, which his father has given him. So it's a very famous place in that context. But other than that, from a practical standpoint, the well is not very useful because it's a mile south of the city. So there may be a few travelers who use this well, a few shepherds occasionally who use this well. But the respectable women of Sychar would not want to travel a mile south from the city and then carry a bucket or two of a gallon of water, which weighs quite a bit. They would not want to have carried that a mile back north to the city. It was impractical. The Bible also tells us that at this point in the day, it's the 6th hour. The Jewish clock starts at 6 a.m., so we know that the time of day is high noon.
It's high noon. Mm-hmm.
It's hot. No one gathers water by custom or by practicality in those days at noon. In other words, the women of any community would go to the wells at the early morning hours.
Well, it's still cool.
It's still cool, and gather water for the day. And then in the evening, the cool of the evening, they would gather water again for the night. So it was a twice-a-day ritual, but it was early and late. The picture that's being painted here is that this well is not a populated place. It's not going to be where the respectable women are gathering. So who would come there, and why would she come there at this point? Well, we know from the story, of course, that there is a woman who comes to the well at this hour. Jesus is sitting there. The speculation in the interpretation of this is she's coming because she's shunned. She's being excluded, not treated well by the respectable men and women of Sychar. So she has to kind of do things by herself, not so much in secret, but she's just avoiding, people by coming at that particular time to that particular well. There's one other or two other elements about this. So first of all, we've established that Jesus should in no way be talking to a Samaritan. Now let's take it another step. In Jesus' day, in his culture, it was against the law to talk to women in public. No man could talk to any woman in public. They could not talk to their sisters, their mothers, their daughters, their friends. And what were they guarding against back in those days? But obviously sexual immorality. Without getting into Middle East sociology and where some of that continues to stand today, let's leave it to the fact that Jesus was not supposed to be talking, number one, to a Samaritan, number two, to a woman. So here comes this woman who is a Samaritan. No way Jesus should talk to her. Thirdly, as they do it, in fact, begin to talk, we learn Jesus says to the woman, go call your husband. And the lady says, sir, I have no husband. And Jesus says, well, you're being honest because the truth is you've been married 5 times and you're currently living with another man, a 6th man. So this is the 3rd strike against this lady, meaning that a divorced woman in Jewish culture was really not well accepted. A Jewish husband, for no good reason, had the ability to have his divorced wife stoned. So this woman, probably lived at some level in fear of her life. The fact that she was probably living with another man may have as much had to do with protection as anything else. But when you think about being divorced 5 times, that is, John, the writer, is painting us a picture of this is as bad a situation as he could possibly describe. Put all of that together and remember, who is Jesus going to talk to? Well, isn't it fascinating, Randy, who Jesus decides to talk to throughout the Gospels? It's not the respectable leaders always. It's not the high priests. It's not, the people who are, socially acceptable. It's oftentimes the outcast. Our story here in John 4 is really a picture of the worst possible outcast there could be. And, I think that, to me, this story is very encouraging because the average man, and in many cases wife, that comes to our center here, participates in our ministry wherever. I mean, they deal with a lot of shame. They are, the men, sexual sinners, and, they have all of that sense of unworthiness. And, to remember that despite whatever their sexual history is, whatever their nationality is, whatever their race is, you are exactly the kind of person that Jesus would want to talk to. Not to scold, not to judge, or not to put down, but to encourage. And we'll see that happen here in just a minute. So what else do they talk about? Well, at some point in their conversation, Jesus doesn't have anything to draw water with. The woman notices that, and she says, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with. You don't have any buckets." And Jesus now says the line that I was referring to at the start of the show that most of us remember. He said, "Truly I tell you that anyone who drinks of the water of this well will always be thirsty, but anyone who drinks of the living water that I offer will never thirst." When I think of this story, it takes me back to really the first time I thought about this story in context to a conversation that I was having with a sex addict. Without getting into any details that would violate anonymity, let me just say that this was a very famous sex addict. He had been very prolific in his sexual history. He had been with over 3,000 women, or so he claimed. He had had sex with $3 million worth of prostitutes. He had had sex with some very, very famous women. When I was listening to his story, I remember thinking, this guy has actually had sex with women that the average man that I work with only fantasizes about. So if you think about famous women, the fact that you may fantasize about those women, this guy had actually done it. He'd been there and done that. At the end of our conversation, 3,000 women, $3 million worth of prostitutes, must have been very high-end prostitutes. He said to me in a voice of abject despair, he said, "It was never enough. I always wanted more." That was the first time that in response to a person, this was 20 plus years ago, but the first time in response to someone, this story came up in my counseling head. And I told him the story. I wish I could say that, he got down on his knees and accepted Christ and accepted a different way of life, but by all indications, that's not the case. But I did pledge to use this story because the average guy that I work with, they think, well, if I could just have this sexual experience with that person, or at least see the picture here or there, the video, whatever. I mean, addicts continually are on some quest, to find the ultimately fulfilling sexual fantasy or sexual experience. And everyone that I've ever talked to, over 5,000 men in the course of our history here, nobody has ever said that any of this is satisfying. So it's just a reminder that Jesus was right. If you drink of the well of sexual immorality, sexual sinfulness, that will never be satisfying.
That thirst will never be quenched. It's the perfect analogy for the men that we work with here.
That is right. So what is satisfying? Well, Jesus says it's living water. Now, this is one of those biblical images that I think sometimes we don't always completely understand the symbolism of that image in Jesus' day. Remember, the story started with who has the authority to baptize. Well, living water to the Jewish mind was clean water, running water, purifying water. Jesus, of course, represents baptism that will, in fact, be life-giving, life-sustaining, providing of salvation for eternity. So, the average Christian thinks about this story and think, well, Jesus is talking about being baptized here, following Christ and all of that. And that is exactly right. But I think the average man that I talk to would like to know, okay, how can this living water be a little bit more applied here? What does that mean? When I teach this story at our 3-day workshop, I basically say that, how many of you came to this workshop with secrets and facts about your history that you'd never ever told anyone, and that you finally were put into a small group of men, told some of those stories, exposed some of those secrets for the first time in your life, and found that men were smiling, were nodding their heads, were understanding. At the end of your sharing, they wanted to affirm you and give you a hug, wanted to encourage you, and all of that. To me, the fellowship of Christ followers who hear the worst and most vile of all histories and are empathetic, sympathetic, understanding, forgiving, grace-filled, that is a living, breathing example of living water to me. So living water often, I think, is about Christ followers in community sharing grace, forgiveness, encouragement to all of those of us who have ever suffered from a great deal of shame. I mean, we need that kind of grace. That's what Jesus is talking about. That is satisfying. That is fulfilling. That does quench the thirst that we all desire, which is, to be accepted, to be loved, to be nurtured, to be included, those kinds of things that we talk about here at Faithful and True.
So as we're wrapping up today's story and today's show, take us through how Jesus provided for this woman his power as the God of second chances with her storied history intact.
The really coolest part of this story, I think, I'm getting excited thinking about it, and I've taught this story hundreds of times, but it never ceases to amaze me. All right, so we've got all these 3 strikes against this woman. They've had this conversation. Some of it's been theological. Finally, at the end of the conversation, the woman kindly has put together in her Jewish background mind. She says, "Are you the one, the Messiah, that we have long been waiting for?" She says. This guy has given her some truth. He's obviously impressed her. He's known some stuff. He said, "Are you the Messiah?" is basically what she's asking. And Jesus says, "I am he." This is the first time in the Gospel of John that Jesus reveals to a human being that he is really in fact the Messiah. Now, who's he revealing it to? This woman who John has painted the picture, the worst possible outcast. Isn't that cool? That you can be the worst possible outcast in your own mind. You can be the most shameful person in the history of the universe, and you're exactly the one that Jesus wants to talk to, and you're the one that Jesus is going to want to know who he really is. To put all of this in its full context, the first story, the first sermon, the first reporting of Jesus being the Messiah is told by a fallen, sinful woman. I don't know about you, but, that's encouraging to me. If ever I doubt my ability to go out someplace and teach or preach or have any kind of authority because of my history, I like to think back on stories like this and say, maybe it's those of us that completely get the need for grace that ought to be the ones that are preaching about it.
Thank you for joining us on the Faithful and True podcast. Well, we hope that you're enjoying this legacy podcast about the God of second chances featuring Dr. Mark Laaser. We hope that this podcast, as well as the many others that we offer on our website, can be eye-opening and beneficial to you. We invite you to visit our podcast or our website, faithfulandtrue.com, where you'll find many resources available to you, as well as our online information and registration for our Men's Journey workshops, which we offer every month here at Faithful and True. There's also information and registration for the Women's Journey workshop and the 2 Couples Journey workshops. We hope you'll look into those and consider those for yourself. In the meantime, we hope this week will be a week for you that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.